Um, so good morning, everybody, and I hope you're all well. And before we start, I like to send my special regards to those of you who could not join us today because, obviously, of Yom Kippur, and to let them know once again that this session is being recorded, and it will be at your disposal whenever you're ready to watch it, starting tonight or tomorrow. Today, we're going to address the on-again, off-again US-Iranian negotiations, and this is map number 1, Michelle, please, that the Biden administration has been quietly conducting with the aim of limiting Tehran's nuclear program and freeing imprisoned Americans. As a matter of fact, the latter objective has actually been achieved just last week, as you might have seen on the news that 5 American prisoners were, thank you, Michelle, 5 American prisoners were released in a swap with 5 Iranian citizens held in American jails. In addition to the release with the American consent of some $6 billion of Iranian money, which was frozen in a South Korean bank account. Even though the administration has repeatedly called any rumors of a nuclear deal false or misleading, the American denial hinges on semantics. Indeed, instead of a formal nuclear deal, or as it was called at the time, plan of action, as the 2015 agreement reached by the Obama administration was called at the time, this time the two parties are negotiating an informal, unwritten understanding, if you will, that would have the same objective of preventing a further escalation in the long hostile relationship with Iran, with a major advantage of not needing Congress's approval. In fact, the current US-Iran talks have resumed at the end of last year, with the Washington Special Envoy for Iran, Robert Malley, holding 2 meetings with Iran's ambassador to the United Nations, and the talks continued this spring in the Gulf Arab state of Oman, which is just across the Gulf of Oman here from Iran. You can see it on the map. With indirect talks, since the Iranian did not wish to come into direct contact with the American side, talks mediated by the Omanis with Tehran's chief nuclear negotiator. First, let's see the subject of the ongoing talks. According to Western sources, if an agreement were to be reached, Iran would agree not to enrich uranium beyond its current production level of 60% purity, which is close to but short of the 90% purity needed to produce a nuclear weapon, a level that the United States has warned Iran that it would force it to a severe response. Iran would also hold lethal attacks on American contractors in Syria and Iraq by its proxies in the region, expand its cooperation with international nuclear agencies, and refrain from selling ballistic missiles to Russia. In return, the US would commit not to tighten sanctions already choking Iran's economy, and not to seek new punitive resolutions at the United Nations and the International Atomic Energy Agencies against Iran for its nuclear activity. Furthermore, the US would unfreeze billions of dollars in Iranian assets whose use would be limited to humanitarian purposes. According to the State Department, the money would be restricted to use by US-approved vendors, third-party vendors, for food and medicine for Iranian citizens, allaying concerns by the Republican majority House of Representatives that billions of dollars are entrusted to a ruthless authoritarian regime that is killing protesters, supporting Russia's Ukraine war effort, and funding anti-Israeli proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah. Let's see now what prompted the Biden administration to talk to Iran once again, despite 2 years of failed efforts to restore the 2015 nuclear deal. First and foremost, the realization that ultimately the preferred option for Washington, which is a deal that reverses Iran's nuclear advances and imposes strict limits and transparency measures on its nuclear program, is just not feasible, at the time anyway, and that the best approach left under the circumstances is to try and head off a major crisis with Tehran. For a short moment last year, the mass protest against the Ayatollah regime gave the administration the impression that for the first time in a generation, the theocracy might be in jeopardy. The hopes of a possible political liberalization were, however, quickly dashed after the violent crackdown by the regime on all anti-government demonstrations. Then came Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has played to Iran's advantage in a way, making Iranian-Russian cooperation closer than ever. Indeed, in exchange for hundreds of Iranian drones and shiploads of ammunition, Russia has provided Iran with political support, cash, and Western technology captured on the Ukrainian battlefield. And chances are that the bilateral ties will deepen over time, as Russia, that remains isolated from the West, is seeking to bypass US-led sanctions by bolstering other trade routes and financial ties, including with Iran, even as the two countries continue to compete in global commodity markets, particularly gas and oil. At the same time, Tehran is also expanding ties with China, its core economic lifeline in a way. So far this year, China has imported about 1 million barrels per day of Iranian crude oil, accounting for about 80% of its total exports, despite US sanctions that prohibit that trade. As a result of all this, the Iranian leaders no longer see the West in general and the United States in particular as a necessary or even viable conduit for economic benefits, convinced that the new global focus of power is shifting eastward. Today, the US is not the world's dominant power. The Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei proclaimed in a speech last November commemorating the US embassy seizure in 1979. Asia will become the center of knowledge, the center of economics, as well as the center of political and military power, he added. That was also made clear by the address delivered by the Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi, who, speaking last year at the United Nations, showed few signs of seeking reconciliation with the United States, even threatening to take revenge of those who had carried out the killing of Iran's top general Qasem Soleimani in 2020. The military and economic support provided by Russia and China has also encouraged the Iranian leadership to continue to improve its already advanced nuclear program by expanding its stockpile of enriched uranium, as we saw, enhance its centrifuge manufacturing capabilities, and better insulate its facilities from military strikes. Not so long ago, Iran's nuclear military program was actually intended to provide Tehran with more chips to play, if you will, in any future negotiation with the United Nations or with the United States. That might no longer be true today, as the Iranian leadership seems increasingly reluctant to trade away any progress toward the bomb, believing that they are on the path to achieving that goal anyway, and that sanctions relief from the United States is unreliable and hinges on the occupant of the White House. Furthermore, dynamics in Iran's immediate neighborhood also play to Tehran's advantage. Just in the past year, Iran has normalized ties with Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates. You can see them both here, the United Arab Emirates down here, Kuwait further north. You can see it also there. And most importantly, with Saudi Arabia, whose name you don't see here on the map, but this is the largest between Kuwait and United Arab Emirates, that all of this is Saudi Arabia, which is, as you know, its major regional rival in a deal that was actually brokered by China. That normalization, by the way, undermines Biden administration traditional approach that has been trying to gain nuclear concessions from Iran by promising greater political and economic ties with its neighbors, a goal which now Tehran has achieved anyway, without the United States, without the support of the United States. It is thus easy to say why Ali Khamenei might believe that he can have his nuclear cake and eat it too. Now, all these developments have prompted the Biden administration to adopt, for now at least, a different approach to Iran, a policy of, if you will, normalization without denuclearization, rather than pursuing two other options: the revival of the Obama's nuclear deal abandoned by the Trump administration, which is a mission impossible now, as I said earlier, considering the oppositions on both sides, or the imposition of additional economic, political, and military pressure on Tehran, pressure that has proven to be mostly inefficient in the past, at the risk of seeing Iran produce unimpeded weapons-grade uranium, or even leave the nuclear non-proliferation treaty as it has threatened to do. Instead, the Biden administration's current policy pursues two immediate major objectives. preventing an Iranian bomb and avoiding the risky escalation that could come with higher pressure on Iran, while still hoping that conditions for a diplomatic approach or solution would become more favorable over time. In that spirit, the administration has already given a few signs of goodwill towards Iran, including a lax enforcement of US sanctions, particularly the Iranian oil exports to China, a restrained response to attacks on US forces in Syria and Iraq by Iranian proxies, as I said earlier, the Hamas and Hezbollah, the decision to forego censuring Iran after it was revealed that it has briefly produced 84% enriched material, just shy of the typical 90% level for weapons-grade uranium, but still high enough to be used in a bomb if produced in sufficient quantity, and the permission for Iran to indirectly access some of its frozen funds in Iraq in exchange of a small increase in international monitoring of its nuclear program. To be sure, the regime's hardliner in Iran lobby for crossing the nuclear threshold. But Iran's nuclear program has always been, as I said earlier, a means to an end, has always been a means to an end. Security, status, independence, and international influence, rather than an end in itself. If those objectives, independence, international influence, and status, can be achieved anyway, the administration hopes that Tehran may conclude that going all the way to a bomb is not only unnecessary, but also places those gains at risk. And there is always a possibility, however remote, as I said also earlier, that over time, the regime may be brought back to the negotiating table if it continues to struggle to meet Iranians' basic social, political, and economic needs, triggering a new wave of mass protests in that country. That sounds like wishful thinking, obviously, but right now anyway, but cannot be ruled out entirely. Also, there is a potential for a possible end to Russia's war in Ukraine, which may also loosen the current close ties between the Islamic Republic and Russia. That said, success defined as no Iranian bomb, no escalation, and the prospect for diplomacy at some point in the future brings its own risks. The first of which being that it might send Iranian leaders the message that their approach of stalling for time works. While Washington waits, Iran can advance its nuclear program, cementing its status as a nuclear threshold state, strengthen its relation with China and Russia, exploit weakened sanctions pressure, and become less isolated on the international stage. Such developments would make any possible new nuclear deal with Iran impossible politically in the United States. As it is, the 2015 deal was never popular in the Congress, but the Biden administration was initially willing to take a chance of reviving it. But circumstances have changed. Today, it is impossible to imagine for the administration to ask Congress to support a nuclear deal that would inevitably enrich a regime that is Moscow's top military supplier, that violently repressed last year's mass protests, and continues to commit serious human rights abuses. With the 2024 elections on the horizon, the administration cannot engage in a fight with the Congress with zero chances of success, particularly for a deal that would almost certainly contain fewer restrictions on Iranian nuclear activity than the original one. The ongoing talks between Washington and Tehran has also troubled the Israeli leadership, who worry that the implementation of new understanding could reduce Western economic pressure on Iran and throw a lifeline to Tehran's economy without sufficiently derailing its nuclear activities. Israel has warned that Iran could suffer dire consequences from producing bomb-worthy uranium. If Iran enriches to the 90% weaponized level, it would be a great error and the price would be heavy, Israel's defense minister said recently. However, chances of an imminent Israeli military strike on the Iranian nuclear facilities are slim. According to the Israeli intelligence, even if Iran were to use its high-speed centrifuges to purify uranium to a level suitable for building a deliverable nuclear weapon, it could still take at least 1 year and perhaps more to build such a bomb. That time interval would certainly allow international detection and trigger the reimposition of UN sanctions, the prospect of which may deter Tehran from attempting a nuclear breakout. So you can see how complex this issue is, since there are no good options, actually, only less bad. And even those are not rock solid. On the one hand, the US and its allies will have to decide whether reimposing UN sanctions on Iran is worth the risk of seeing its regime carry out the threats of bringing its nuclear program to a conclusion. On the other hand, Iran will have to decide whether carrying out those threats is worth taking the risk of disrupting an otherwise favorable environment, including a potential military strike on its nuclear facilities. And maybe, ironically, these high stakes at play will eventually encourage Washington and Tehran to come to a political solution, a diplomatic solution. So this is where we stand today on the Iranian-American talks. Whether they will be successful in the end remains to be seen, because obviously there are still some points in that agreement which have not been worked out, which are still difficult to work out. And whether something like that can be worked out before the electoral campaign starts in earnest by the end of this year also remains to be seen, because in addition to the Ukrainian issue, then the Iranian nuclear understanding, if you will also become bone of contention. And it is not sure that the public opinion will be favorable to such an understanding at this point. Now, on Ukraine. Well, last week was not a particularly good week for President Zelensky. As he returned to Kiev from his four-day visit to the United Nations in New York, to the White House in Washington and to the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa, with plenty of promises of continued support, but basically empty-handed. This was Zelensky's second wartime trip to the United States. The first one having taken place in December, last December, if you remember. Last week's visit was, however, very different from the first one, where, if you remember, also lawmakers gave him a hero's welcome and invited him to address a joint session of Congress. This time, however, the tone was more muted, and most polls indicate a softening of the support among Americans. Americans who are focused more on domestic problems than international commitments, against the backdrop, again, of the presidential campaign, which is ahead of us. In Washington, the Republican opposition, led by House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, who had declined in the past several invitations to visit Ukraine, held a closed-door meeting with Zelensky, during which several of his colleagues quizzed the Ukrainian leader on the pervasive corruption in his country and his vision of a plan for victory, reflecting their sentiment that the United States has thrown itself into an open-ended conflict, even if its troops are not involved, an open-ended conflict that the current administration has no idea how to stop. Even Zelensky's visit to the White House did not go as expected. While President Biden announced an additional $24 billion aid package to Ukraine, which will still have to be approved by the Republicans also, he turned down Ukraine's main request, which was the delivery of the long-range Army tactical missile systems, or ATACMS, which can strike targets 190 miles away, placing Crimea, for instance, within easy reach of Ukrainian artillery. What this visit really confirmed is that Biden's reiterated assurances to stick with Zelensky for as long as it takes, according to the president's words, may not be as ironclad as they were once seemed, and that Ukraine's fate is ultimately increasingly aligned with Biden's own political destiny. Before going to Washington, Zelensky stopped in New York to address the UN General Assembly and then the Security Council. But there too, his performance experienced some misses. In his speech to the General Assembly, Zelensky accused three EU countries, without naming them, Hungary, Slovakia, and Poland in particular, and I quote, of feigning solidarity by indirectly supporting Russia, in reference to the decision by these three governments to ban imports on Ukrainian crops, as we saw it last week, in order to protect the cereal production of their own farmers. Now, that public scolding addressed to a country, Poland, which has taken in over 2 million Ukrainian refugees and provided huge amounts of humanitarian and military assistance to Kiev, and Zelensky's threat to take the issue to the World Trade Organization, needless to say, did not sit well with Poland. The same evening, the Polish prime minister announced that his country would cease supplying arms from its arsenal to Kiev, while still allowing the transit of Western arms deliveries to Ukraine. And even though Ukraine backtracked since, suggesting that talks be held on that issue, this incident is likely to leave its mark on the relationship between the two neighbors. Generally speaking, also, Zelensky's address to the United Nations highlighted in a way the general lack of support for Ukraine's diplomatic initiatives, with the emerging countries, in particular, the so-called Global South, which time and time again indicated that their major concerns were global warming and sustainable development, not Ukraine. As a result of this, Kiev had to cancel a meeting at the UN it had hoped to schedule on the events in his country. In his address to the Security Council, Zelensky called its members to strip Moscow of its veto power that Russia enjoys as one of the Council's 5 permanent member states, knowing perfectly well that such a move would be exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, since Moscow, and Zelensky acknowledged it himself, would not give up this privilege voluntarily. So here is where we stand of Ukraine. The only encouraging news, encouraging development for Ukraine has been the announcement that the first deliveries of the US-made Abrams tanks had arrived in Ukraine, which will reinforce the Ukrainian counter-offensive. Finally, a few words about last week's flare-up in the long-standing conflict opposing Azerbaijan and Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh, a mountainous enclave the size of Rhode Island in the South Caucasus. And that's map number 2, Michelle, please. Now, what happened there last week? In a 24-hour blitzkrieg, Azerbaijani troops overwhelmed the Armenian separatist forces and asserted total control over the region. With no, thank you, Michelle, with no assistance from Armenia for Armenia's regular army, or the 2,000 Russian peacekeepers deployed there as in a sort of buffer, in a buffer zone. The separatists were forced to lay down their arms and accept to negotiate what the president of Azerbaijan called a peaceful reintegration into Azerbaijan of the some 120,000 Karabakh Armenians, who form about 80% of the total population in Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, Armenia proper, as a country, has 3 million people. We addressed this regional conflict, if you remember, some of you were here in 2020, after the last conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So today I'll give you a quick reminder of the situation there. First, Nagorno-Karabakh, that you see here on the map, which is in brown and yellow, is a former Armenian province, which was officially given to Azerbaijan by Stalin in 1923, when Armenia and Azerbaijan became Soviet republics, the Soviet Union. But this Nagorno-Karabakh region kept an autonomous status since it has a population more than 80% Armenian at the time. Now, a relative calm prevailed in this region when it was part of the Soviet Union until the end of the 1980s, when the Soviet Union started to weaken. The two Soviet republics began to press for independence, giving new meaning to what had in essence been internal administrative borders of Nagorno-Karabakh. If you will, a little bit like in Crimea state, which Khrushchev gave to Ukraine, but it was just a technical administrative decision, since Ukraine at the time was part of the Soviet Union. Now, after their independence in 1991, Armenia and Azerbaijan went to war over Nagorno-Karabakh. Armenia emerged victorious in 1994, and the conflict resulted in hundreds of thousands of refugees as Armenians fled Azerbaijan and Azeris, or Azerbaijanis, fled Armenia. After the war, Azerbaijan, backed by Turkey in particular, and its oil and gas wealth, started to gradually rebuild its army and eventually went to war again in 2020, this time defeating the Armenian army and retaking control of much of the region. That's why you see this region in two different colors. In 2020, Azerbaijan took back everything that's in yellow here. So Nagorno-Karabakh, which was a larger province, shrank to the size of what you see in brown. And the only way to access the Nagorno-Karabakh from Armenia was to go through Azerbaijani territory, if you will, through the Lachin crossing. That the only corridor, the Lachin corridor, you see it down here. That was the only way for Armenia to connect to Nagorno-Karabakh. A ceasefire at the time in 2020, which was brokered by the Kremlin and reinforced by Russian peacekeepers, which I mentioned earlier, was signed at the time, but violation on both sides persisted. Now, the later attack by Azerbaijan a week ago came with Moscow bogged down by its war in Ukraine, which partly explained the passivity of the Russian peacekeepers who sat idly during the takeover. Russia's passivity may have another explanation, which is a recent distancing of Armenia from Moscow, as evidenced by the last month's decision of the Armenian government to join the International Criminal Court, the same court that issued an arrest warrant against President Putin, which means in practice that Putin could be arrested if he sets foot on the Armenian soil. In its defense, also, Moscow pointed out that Armenia itself and its own military did not come to the rescue of its community in Nagorno-Karabakh. So it is not in a position to give other countries lessons or to lecture them what they should have done. That said, the collapse of the separatist resistance in Nagorno-Karabakh represents a major victory for Azerbaijan President Ilham Aliyev in his quest to bring the Armenian majority region back under Baku. Baku is the capital, you can see far right on the map of Azerbaijan, under Baku's control. It sparked jubilation among Azerbaijanis who now believe that this issue has been resolved once and for all, and led to riots in Yerevan. Yerevan, you see it here on the other side, in Armenia, which is the Armenian capital, where demonstrators asked for the prime minister's arrest for betrayal. So while talks, the first round of talks took place over the weekend, we'll see how this is going to unfold. What can be said so far is that the international community has been very silent about this issue. And only France, through its president, came out in favor of doing something for Nagorno-Karabakh. But the other members of the EU and the United States, as a matter of fact, had been silent about this issue. France's reaction can be also explained by the fact that you have a very large Armenian community in France, between 600 and 800,000 people. So France, I guess, had to react in some ways, at least in words, to what is happening over there. So this is for this week, and I open the floor to your question, comments, and reactions. Robert, I see your message here. The significance of the corridor is still not clear to me. Would you expand on this point? Yes, the corridor allowed the Armenia to have exchange of trade. People went through Nagorno-Karabakh to Armenia and the other way around. So it was a lifeline, in a way, to Nagorno-Karabakh, which is otherwise surrounded by Azerbaijan. So it was extremely important for them to have this opening to the rest of the world. And as a matter of fact, this corridor has been used yesterday and the day before yesterday by the UN agencies, which have been delivering humanitarian aid and food and blankets, because it's getting cold in the Caucasus at this time of the year, to the Armenian community there. About 10,000 Armenians also left Nagorno-Karabakh to come into Armenia itself since the beginning of, since the end of this blitzkrieg. And more are expected to come as Nagorno-Karabakh will obviously be under Azerbaijani control and Azerbaijani administration. So some of them might be waiting to see what's in store for them, but some of them probably who were more involved, if you will, with the Armenian government in some way or other, preferred to leave Nagorno-Karabakh to come into Armenia proper. So we'll see how things will be developing there. So, but just to answer your question, this corridor is vital to keep Nagorno-Karabakh and its Armenian community alive. Anything else? Come on, everybody. I know it's Monday morning. I know it's a green day outside, but you, Tom, are you there? Did you recover from last week? Obviously, he's not. Something else about any subject that Ukraine or that you'd like discussed? Well, either I was particularly clear today, or I was particularly boring, because because I see no reactions from, no comments from you. I realize that we have a smaller attendance today. Okay, well, if it's still muted, Michelle, I think we're just going to say goodbye to everybody, and unless once, twice, three times, unless there is a question.
Rhoda.
Hi, Judy. Yes. Hello.
I see that Rhoda has something up, but I just wanted to say what an amazing map that was, the first one that showed all of those countries arrayed around the Caspian Sea.
Yes.
I had never seen that in that form before.
You might have, or you might have not attended our meetings when we brought up Iran and Gulf area, because it seems to me that what's surprising to you actually on that map? The proximity of those countries, or what surprising?
How many of them there are?
Oh, you didn't know?
Pakistan at the bottom, and Turkey up at the top, and
there are six of them basically. The Gulf. I'm talking about the Gulf. Thank you, Michelle.
Yes.
Talking about the Gulf states. You can see them all actually. I don't know if you can see Oman. Yeah, you can see Oman also. You have Kuwait, you have Saudi Arabia, you have Qatar, you have United Arab Emirates, you have Oman.
And up at the top, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Turkey.
Yes, that's on the Iranian side. Yes, and do not forget Afghanistan and
right.
Pakistan. That those are all this region. Actually, you're absolutely right. All this region is very often, for different reasons, in the news.
Yes.
And not only Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the Gulf countries and Iran, but also, Turkey, is one of them. Iraq is another one. Iraq is also on the left side, on my left actually, on the left side of the map, next to Iran. All these countries are in the news very often. Armenia, you see Azerbaijan, Armenia that we mentioned today. So all these countries are, unfortunately, in many ways, are in the news more often than not. Indeed.
Yes. It just, puts Iran right in the heart of all those countries. That's, I guess, what, since the map is centered on Iran, of course, it looks that way, but it's very interesting when you frame a piece of the world.
Well, when you, especially when you visualize it, and
yes.
you can see how close they are to each other, basically, and what the issues are. A huge issue between Iran, for instance, and the Gulf area, the Arab states in that area. Iran, as you know, is a Shiite Muslim state, but is not an Arab state, unlike Saudi Arabia, which is a Sunni state and an Arab state, because they are part of what used to be called under the British protectorate, the Arab Peninsula. Okay, so those countries are Arab on the left side, Arabic. On the right side, you have Iran, which is they are Muslims, but they are not. The Iranians are Muslims, but they are not Arabs. And then you have here's the Gulf of Oman, which is important actually to both Saudi Arabia and the Gulf area and Iran. And there is also some fighting over there, and the Persian Gulf here, which is also of concern to the United States, which has many vessels in this area to listen to, basically, which are used as floating listening posts to know what's going on in Iran. In other words, so it's a flashpoint, if you will, of the issues of the Middle East, of that part of the Middle East. And then the other part of eastern part of the Middle East, you have obviously Israel, and then all the Arab states surrounding it. So you have two flashpoints, so to speak: the Western Asia, in a way, Western Middle East, I should say, and then you have the Eastern Middle East.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Pierre?
Rhoda, yes.
Pierre?
Yes.
There was another question in the chat.
I saw that.
Iraq, the relationship to Iran. You got that?
Yeah. There are two other questions. Yeah, I see them in the chat.
And then the other one about Armenia. You got that one? Okay.
Yes. What is Iraq's relationship to Iran now? We are going to look into that also at some point later in our session. For now, they are good. They are good because first of all, Iraq, unlike any, well, let me see, Qatar maybe, I'm not sure. Iraq has a Shiite majority population, unlike all the other Arab states. And therefore, it has a Shiite president, which has relatively close relations with Tehran, with the Ayatollahs. However, that close relation has not gone far enough for the Iranians, who have been pushing the Iraqis or the Iraqi government to to expel all American presence in Iraq, something that the Iraqis have been reluctant to do up to now. So they are close in a way to Iran culturally and economically speaking, obviously, but politically they keep their distances from Iran, because remember also, and that is still fresh in the Iraqi memory and the Iranians also, the 8-year war that opposed the two countries when Saddam Hussein was president of Iraq in the 90s, with hundreds of thousands of people killed on both sides. So even though obviously their relations improved, there is some reluctance on the part of the Iraqis to go further. I got here a question. Do you think that the suddenness of the attack was the reason for non-response by Armenia? That could be one of the elements. Armenia was not prepared. The Armenian army was not prepared, but mostly I believe is that the Armenian prime minister realized that they are in no position, the Armenian army is no position to oppose the Azerbaijani army, which again has had time since the 90s, as I said, to reorganize its army and to make it a very modern army with the help of a number of countries, because Azerbaijan has something that Armenia does not, which is oil and gas. And they've been selling oil and gas to a number of countries, taking advantage of the fact that there are sanctions on their competition, like Iran and Russia. So the Azerbaijanis have been extremely active in that area, and they signed a number of very lucrative contracts with Western European countries, which financed the revival of their army. So the Armenians were probably in no position, even if they had time to send troops to Nagorno-Karabakh, they were in no position to oppose the Azerbaijani blitzkrieg, because in 24 hours, needless to say that the separatists, or at least the local Armenian army, was not in any position to fight, and this war, so to speak, was over in 24 hours. Now, the future of Nagorno-Karabakh is another question. Again, the international community has not reacted particularly, and I believe, that's my impression, I believe that for most of these countries, even though they might, in a way, denounce this occupation, but let's not forget also there is another point which is extremely important, is that the international community recognizes the Azerbaijani authority over Nagorno-Karabakh. Internationally, Nagorno-Karabakh is part of Azerbaijan. So it's very difficult now to come back and to say that, in a way, Azerbaijan invaded its own territory. Obviously, Nagorno-Karabakh was the exception in a way, because it has a 90% Armenian community. But administratively speaking and internationally, Nagorno-Karabakh was recognized as part of Azerbaijan. So for all these reasons, I guess, Nagorno-Karabakh's fate will be the type of lost and found thing or a casual of a casualty of the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan with no military intervention from the outside. Armenia cannot count on any time. Even the prime minister of Armenia, who's in a very difficult position because there was rioting in Armenia after this 24-hour blitzkrieg, with many Armenian families in Armenia proper, who has obviously ties to Nagorno-Karabakh relatives, families, who accused the prime minister of betrayal and asked for his arrest. But that being said, in private, it appears that most Armenians acknowledge that Nagorno-Karabakh face is sealed and there is nothing much that Armenia can do about it. But to answer your question once again, the suddenness of the attack definitely was surprised even the Russian peacekeepers who had no instructions one way or the other how to react. And I believe that the Kremlin just told them to stand by and let it happen, because again, there was no need for Russian casualties in this conflict, and that Russia was not going to intervene there. They don't need another front with everything that they've been busy with in Ukraine. Anything else? Hi, Andrew.
Hello there.
You have a question? Or Andrew? Hello?
Hello, yep, I just dialed in from a cell phone, so my audio is not working right.
Oh, I thought you were it sounds like you are in the laundry room.
Yeah, yeah, it could be, close enough.
You have some you have a question or a comment?
No, I missed the whole session, unfortunately, Pierre. So
Well, again, it will be it's recorded, you know.
Yes, we'll go to it this afternoon.
You can listen to it, and if you have anything to say, to comment, next week.
Sounds good.
Okay, so now you can go back to your laundry. All right. If there is nothing else, then I see you all next week. And I believe next week we're going to take a look at the situation in Afghanistan, actually, in a way to answer Rhoda's concern. We stay in the region, so to speak, and we're going to see what's going on in Afghanistan 2 years almost to the day after the US has left that country. What the situation is. Okay, so listen, have all a great week, and thank you, Michelle, and I see you all next week. Thank you all. Goodbye.